Welcome to JF with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I am here with Professor Daphne Ingber, visiting professor at UC Irvine in the Political Science Department. Daphne, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, happy to be here.
So welcome to Irvine. I know that you just got here 10 weeks ago from Israel, and your research is a whole bunch of fascinating things, but specifically you talk about whistleblowing within the Israeli government and the IDF. We'll eventually get there, so let's start broad, just for people that have maybe heard the term whistleblower before. I mean, what is this sort of technical definition?
Right. So whistleblowing is one of those things where everybody has like an opinion, or it's very much like just being discussed just in the media, but in various ways where you could see it, on both sides of the political map being discussed in very different ways, right? So I think the most, basic definition would be an insider that comes from within an organization with some kind of condemning information about organizational ills. Now that is, and with the goal of working for the public, so public interest. That's an important one. We'll get back to that. One of the sort of important aspects of whistleblowing is that it's an individual act, right? It's a person that comes out with information because they think that it is in the public interest.
And probably the most famous, I'm imagining most listeners, although I brought this up in class last quarter, I told you about this, and students hadn't heard of Edward Snowden, but I'd imagine a lot of my listeners probably have heard of that case. But for people that, need a refresher, or that name, in my head, that name is sort of synonymous with whistleblowing. If you say whistleblower, and I close my eyes, that's sort of the first word to pop into my head. Can you talk about the Snowden case? Was that sort of unique? Is there a reason why that's sort of seen as at least in America, the quintessential whistleblower?
The Snowden case is a case that's dear to my heart because I focus on a particular type of whistleblowing, which is national security whistleblowing, it's important to note that you can see whistleblowers both in sort of the public sector, but also in the private sector. We can get to that later. We were just discussing, kind of big tech whistleblowing.
I'm going to give you all my conspiracy theories in a second. So just
definitely
wait, yeah.
So like OpenAI and, Francis Hogan and all that. So we're not going to be talking right now about big tech. When we talk about national security whistleblowing, and, Snowden is synonymous with that. What we really see is someone that comes from within the intelligence and sort of security agencies with information that's classified. And that's a whole different ballgame when we talk about that, because then that person who has signed NDAs, who is working within a system that, is classified, state secrets, is opening themselves to a world of pain, right? On the day after, whistleblowing, which is what we see with Snowden. He came out in 2013, in June 2013, but he did it in a very smart way. He was from the NSA, of course, and what he exposed was sort of a broad scope of mass surveillance being, take programs that he took part in, that were not only targeting, terrorists or people, overseas that the US would want to target, but also citizens, making us all sort of a part of this catch-all system, right? He exposed this with great personal risk, which we'll get to. And at the end of the day, he did it from Hong Kong. So he managed to flee the US in time, and then avoiding persecution with what we know today in the US to be the Espionage Act. So that was sort of, and today we see him in Russia, which we can also discuss, and he has, I think, citizenship already in Russia, but he managed to flee.
I'm sure Russia's thrilled. Just in terms of Russia's attempt to sow disinformation and just skepticism, in America it's probably somewhat of a national hero.
That was something that that kind of Snowden was always, really criticized for, but he didn't mean to end up in Russia. We can get to that. I don't want to really get into the whole intricacies of, how he tried to flee. He did have like a flyover through Russia, and then his, all of his, means of transportation were revoked, and then he kind of was in a tight spot where, if he would return to the US, he wouldn't be able to face a fair trial. So that was kind of the problem of returning. What he ended up doing was staying in Russia, but by then, what he claims is that all of the information was already destroyed. So, but of course, there's that question of, what the Russians did get out from this deal.
Interesting. I'm just pontificating for a second. So just a little bit of a half-baked question, but whistleblowing almost seems like a catch-22, because in order for governmental, stopping crime or stopping terrorism policies to be effective, they have to be doing things that are a little bit covert, because if the whole world knew exactly how the government was trying to stop terrorism, terrorists would obviously just avoid that. Yet on the other hand, part of having checks and balances within a democracy is having a check on the government overreach. So it seems like someone like Snowden, or I'm sure right now in 2025, the government is doing things that we don't know about to presumably keep us safe. But if everybody becomes a whistleblower at some point, the government almost will cease to function. I don't know. I mean, is this a real tension? And I'm just curious to run that by you.
Well, there is that classic tension, you're completely right, between the public's right to know and upholding national security. And that's always been a balance that, or sort of like an imagined balance, right? That that tension between, accountability, democratic accountability. We could also see, whistleblowing as something that mends democratic deficits. When we talked about Snowden, but really the context, whistleblowing is not like a new occurrence. We could think about, 70s cases, like, the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg. There we see cases where really the public's right to know about what was going on in Vietnam, the fact that the war was dredging on when it really could have been, when really like the information that the public needed to know wasn't getting to the public about what was really going on the ground. So these types of whistleblowing actions or like practices are really a part of upholding a democracy. So that tension completely exists. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I think so. Well, it just seems, it's interesting because Snowden is seen as a hero on elements of the right and elements of the left, and it seems like everybody in the middle kind of sees him as a villain, which is always very interesting. So you have the sort of, Tucker Carlson types on the American, alt-right or far right, where he's a hero. And then everybody sort of in the mainstream conservatives and mainstream liberals sort of view him as a little bit of a villain. And then you go far enough left, and all of a sudden he becomes a hero again in these left spaces. And it's just very interesting to see, it obviously correlates with, extreme skepticism of the government and, distrust of institutions. It's obviously been a big thing in America. You also have this other thing that we were talking about just before the podcast, where all, functioning democracies to some extent have this balance between freedom and security, right? If the government taps all of our phones, crime will probably go down, or terrorism will probably go down, but our freedom will also go down because we'll have some people spying on us. So that's a tension that exists. I mean, I guess point blank, I know usually academics don't like these black and white questions, but like when you think of somebody like Snowden, is he a hero? Is he a villain? Is it sort of more of a gray area there?
Yeah, I think a lot of my work as a researcher is really to fend off these kind of binary. But I acknowledge that the fact that we're even discussing it right now is because it captured the fascination of a public that really does understand things as black and white, right? Like there are people. I don't think it's necessarily right and left, right? Because you could see whistleblowing as a nonpartisan issue. We could see, distrust in government as really also a nonpartisan issue. I don't know if you would agree with me.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Right. So those elements are all there in the story. I'm interested in what are the political repercussions of whistleblowing, right? Like just beyond even how they're discussed, because a lot of the conversation at the end of the day focuses on Snowden. Is he a hero or a villain? But what about the topics? What about what he exposed, right? What about surveillance? What about those programs? And sort of, we did discuss it a bit, but that's something that kind of captures the focus. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, whistleblowers, they're sort of characters, they humanize a political issue that might not have gained, the headlines, maybe people don't want to be talking about, the extent of surveillance on their phones because they themselves are, sharing nonstop their minutia of their lives, right? So maybe if that issue wasn't humanized, it wouldn't be discussed. But on the other hand, once you have a face to it, sometimes the issue itself gets disregarded. So that again is a tension.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people were surprised and maybe even still would be surprised to consider the extent to which nothing they're doing, especially online with her phones, is private. I mean, obviously, Snowden was, already 12 years ago. The technology's gotten much better. I mean, just, obviously one of the, I think the big elephants in the room with Israel is this Pegasus technology that Israel developed that basically has the ability to hack into iPhones without the user even knowing. And so, it could be, and Israel, of course, has been selling it to all sorts of governments, some democratic governments, some non-democratic governments. I think they, there was a lot of uproar about this. This is probably 2 years ago when this, they were selling it to all these different countries. And so probably right now the government, is even listening to this conversation, very, very interested into, exactly how we're going to depict this. But I think it is something that people weren't really attuned to before Snowden. At least for me, that's when this became, now it's sort of like a joke. We're like, oh, the government's spying on all of us, and everyone says, haha, but everyone kind of knows that it's true. But I think it was a little bit of a shock. Before we narrow down and then, talk about specifically Israel, because I think that's extremely interesting. Let's talk about industry for a second. We were talking before this about some of the big, whistleblowers of American industries where there's all sorts of good conspiracy theories. So there was obviously the whistleblower in Boeing who mysteriously died and went missing. You were telling me about this OpenAI case of the whistleblower that mysteriously went missing. For the AI case, only because I wasn't so familiar, so I can't imagine listeners would be. Can you just paint the 2-minute background and then let's talk about this conspiracy theories? I mean, when someone like him or the Boeing guy goes missing, I mean, could this be foul play on behalf of the institution?
I would like to just correct a bit. It's not that they went, I mean, the OpenAI case, he was just ruled as a suicide. And now there are conspiracy theorists or people's, even his family discussing sort of this case. Elon Musk tweeted it a week ago, just really asking whether there was foul play in his death. And the reason is that he pledged to take part in a trial of, OpenAI. The things that he did come out with before his death, which was in this November, was that OpenAI is using copyrighted material, and this is something that's, diverges from what they officially, state. And so that's like a big controversy. Whether that got him killed, officials say no, but there is that, this really ties into sort of a whole gamut of, research in whistleblowing studies on sort of retaliation and whether institutional retaliation operates within the law. We could see it in, laws such as the Espionage Act that, have tried whistleblowers, in the US, for example. We have our own laws in Israel. Well, national security whistleblowing in Israel is outlawed, essentially. So that there's that.
But isn't the definition, I mean, I'm just, isn't the definition of a whistleblower that works for the government by nature breaking the law? Like, wasn't Snowden, or no? Or do I have a...
So that's a great question. There are, whistleblower protections in place in various contexts. We can also discuss, each country has its own framework, infrastructure, and national security whistleblowers are the most precarious group within whistleblowing group, right? The general group, because whistleblowing can be a service even for that organization. It can, it can expose corruption, fraud, waste, abuse, environmental issues. It's when we think of the 90s, like the Aaron Brockowitzes, and it can really reveal things that are not only good for society, but also for the organizations themselves, because it can reveal, wrongdoings that maybe individuals within an organization are doing. So it's not necessarily even a radical act. It's a reformative act, in a sense, I would argue. So in the Israeli case and the American case, it kind of differs that.
Okay, so let's move over the ocean to Israel. you can, I'll just paint the picture. You can let me know if you agree or disagree with this classification. Israel, one, is a lot smaller, right? You know, I think
Yeah.
Israel's population just hit 10 million this week. You know, America's probably, you know, a 3.5 million. So, you know, there's an order of magnitude of 30 different. Israel also, the average person tends to interact a lot more with the government and military than America. We were talking on the way here, you know, even just, you know, the military service, Israel, almost everybody goes to the military for sure. Everybody has a family member that has gone to the military. In America, in most cultures, it's sort of rare to even know somebody who's gone to the military. Israel also, the threats to its national existence are a lot more explicit and in people's face than in America. I mean, you don't really, I mean, there are threats that the government's dealing with, but they're not really front and center. So it seems like Israel ends up being a lot more centralized and top down in some sense. So I can't imagine, I would imagine it's much harder for somebody to be a whistleblower within Israel, especially in the IDF, than it would be in America. I'm curious if you agree with that
Definitely.
classification.
No, I would completely agree. Because what we see in Israel, whereas, you know, the general, albeit flawed, you know, protections exist for whistleblowers. By the way, there isn't really a literal translation to whistleblowing in Hebrew. It's called chosfei shchituyot, which chosfei shchituyot means exposers of corruption. So in sort of our watershed moments in sort of the Israeli culture, it was more centered around corruption, which is still very much present and alive in Israel.
Yeah.
I would also add. With national security, there's also this society, as you said, pretty astutely, that very much differs from American society in the sense that it's a militarized society. Everyone, the military and sort of security institutions of Israel are put on kind of a pedestal in the way that, you know, the public's right to know, instead of, you know, only demanding more information, more transparency, it also is very much centered around, you know, trusting them and giving them a sort of open check to do what they do and just to keep the peace, to keep security, national security, because that sort of securitizing issues is something that, you know, can close the book on, you know, public debate very easily, right? And which here doesn't really play out in the same way.
Well, American culture seems to have an innate skepticism of government that, you know, I mean, probably all people historically are skeptical of authority, but America, just because of our, you know, founding narrative / myth, you know, we can debate about the historicity of this another time, but it's just, you know, we used to have this very oppressive, you know, British government, and then we threw it off, and now it's, you know, a people's republic, and, you know, therefore, you know, everything is, you know, the Constitution is to, you know, limit the government, and so, you know, the right to speech and the right to bear arms, and it's all to, you know, throw, whereas, you know, a place like Israel, you know, one, you know, obviously there's no constitution, which creates a whole a whole separate mess, you know, I've talked about that many times on the podcast, so we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but it just seems like there isn't that same, you know, innate distrust of government and you know, even other rules like Israel, obviously, you know, there is freedom of press in Israel, but it's not as free as the American freedom of press.
We have censorship laws, we have like a military censor, or we used to have, now it's a bit different,
but it seems like the average Israeli, when I talk to them, this is totally anecdotal, but I would, you know, imagine it fits data. The average American, if you talked about a military censor, I think would innately say, you know, what the heck, as a American taxpayer, I don't want there to be a military censor. If something's happening, good or bad or whatever, I want to know. Versus in Israel, it seems like most people are okay if you tell them, you know, whether rightfully or wrongfully, you know, actually we need, you know, for security reasons, please don't, you know, say anything about this or talk about this or text on WhatsApp about this. It seems like the average Israeli is just, you know, blindly trusting the government to some extent of saying, oh, okay, great, you know, the military.
Okay, 2 points, because you've said really, you know, I pretty much agree with some of the, you know, main points that you made. I would, you know, push you on the government versus, you know, security and military institutions. There is a huge divide in Israel, even as we speak, you know, debates and clashes between the two, and between particularly, you know, the civil or understanding of what's going on is, I would argue it's very much distrusting of government. We can also see it in polls, like current polls, versus still an all-time high in their trust of the Shabak, the IDF and of the IDF spokesperson. So you see a society that is very much entrenched in, national security and trusting the institutions that are in charge of upholding national security on the one hand, but that doesn't translate to trust of government because of, a main range of issues that I'm sure that you've discussed on your podcast of recent, but mainly I would say it has to do with this break from mamlachtiyut, which we saw in the first early years of Israel, where it was one and the same. The things that you were saying, that government and military, they were all part of like this, this approach of mamlachtiyut, centralization, where but now it's kind of like, I would say from the 80s on, it's kind of broken, and there's been more a culture of civil society and protest. And that also has to do with the reality of who governs us, right? Of the government itself, of, the corruption trials of Bibi, and the fact that many Israelis today are not so sure that the government is upholding their best interests, right? So
I think I totally agree. And it's just so interesting that trust for the IDF is still at all-time highs, just because, in most Western countries, the trust of institutions, especially the military. I mean, you look at, again, I talked about, the far right and far left's, glamorization of Snowden. Another interesting, talking point between, far right and far left in America is being anti-military, right? The idea of sort of military industrial and complex. You see again people on, people like Tucker Carlson on the right, endlessly bemoaning, military bloat. And then also on the left, you see people endlessly bemoaning military bloat. Whereas in Israel, I mean, are those same conversations happening in any major way? And, it just seems like, I mean, again, some for obvious reason, but it just seems like there's a lot more innate trust in top-down authority, maybe not Bibi Netanyahu, because again, at this point, there's so many different layers of corruption there, for so many different reasons. It makes sense why he's so polarizing, but it's interesting we're not having that same moment with the IDF.
Yeah, I think that sort of conversations in Israel are very much there. It would depend, on it's just like here, it depends on whether you're talking about, the listeners of like, Fox News or, like Tucker Carlson types, or, it really debates like depends on who you're talking about, because we do have like a Wutzal Beisle with like the conspiracy theories and, the enemy from within theory about October, like a conspiracy theory about October 7, and even, governmental efforts to discredit the IDF at the moment. So you do see these clashes happening, but it doesn't translate into broader distrust in the military. And I would argue that has a lot to do with the fact that it's a mass military. And as we go back to foundations, you were talking about the foundations of a nation and how that influences so civic understanding, civic trust, right? And I would argue the same with, the military, because everybody participates. It's a mass military. It's very different than a professional military in the US, where not everyone participates, not everyone feels part of, and then that also influences even sort of the emotional reactions to what we're seeing today. And that doesn't mean that, Israelis argue with everything that's happening, right? We do see mass protests every week against the war, to end the war, to bring back the hostages. But in terms of, trust in institution, we do still see that trust, right? Which is interesting.
Yeah. So a couple of weeks ago, maybe even months ago, the New York Times had an episode about Israeli use of Palestinian human shields in Gaza. I listened to this, it was about 40 minutes. I think it was one of their daily episodes. And it talked about, I think it was a whistleblower in one of these units that was basically, reached out to the media and said, the exact case. And, there's a whole bunch of reasons I was upset the New York Times published this, because I don't know what your, opinion is on all this, and I won't force you to answer this, but it just seemed like it was a very minor thing that was happening, but that's a conversation for another side. But the crux of it was somebody in a unit that has been patrolling Gaza, and obviously when you go into different houses, just to set it up for listeners of the podcast, there's obviously all these booby traps, and so they were forcing Palestinians or Gazans that were had nothing to do with Hamas. They were just innocent bystanders into these houses to make sure that it wasn't booby trapped. And this guy was a whistleblower. And I think it connects to sort of this wider, I mean, there are a lot of, people either currently or formerly in the IDF. There's obviously the group, B'Tselem or other groups. Breaking the silence. And so, these groups are obviously not appreciated by the vast majority
by the
of Israelis. But talk to me about about the culture there in terms of, I mean, I can't even imagine what it must take for an IDF soldier to be that guy who, tries to, go public with this. So talk a little bit about that, and then what sort of are the repercussions in Israel for somebody to actually go out and say, hey, our unit is doing this thing that goes against not just, international law. Okay, fine. There's a bunch of reasons why I think Israelis, are skeptical of international law. But the IDF code of ethics, of course, which, is also against the use of, Palestinian, human shields and everything like that. Talk to me about the dynamics here.
So you're talking about Noal Shechen, right?
I think so. I don't remember the name.
Yeah, it's called Noal Shechen, which is like the neighbor procedure, right, or protocol, which was outlawed in Israel, right, within Israel. And then it just, kind of morphed into different names. And we do see, violations. And I think the important part of whistleblowers or just conscientious people within organizations is just to speak up to still uphold that trust. In the end of the day, I, as an Israeli, not as even a scholar or, I want to feel that a system that I was a part of is still representing what I think it is, right? Like in Israel, there's this saying, like the most moral, right? The IDF is the most moral military in the world, right? Like if it's not, then that creates a legitimacy crisis within the system. That creates a problem for the IDF to then, get boots on the ground from all of society, right? So we do have to uphold a lot, not only for international not only for international reasons, but also for local reasons. That's the important sort of part of it. Understanding that whistleblowers, in the end of the day, many of them are acting on pro-social reasons and are patriots in that sense, right? That's something that maybe people wouldn't agree about. Like some people wouldn't agree about Snowden or about other polarizing cases, just Chelsea Manning, right? Or back home in Israel, when we think of Mordechai Vanunu or Anat Kam from the IDF, right? So Anat Kam case, which is
I've actually never heard of it.
Yeah. She's not known that much. I did discuss her like in my courses, and it was really interesting to sort of think of the parallels there between U.S. cases that are being discussed on much broader scale, which is understandable because the U.S. Israel is this small and certain region of the world we're used to being discussed about, but for different reasons, right? So the Anat Kam case is from 2010, 2011, kind of like unfolded. She was before her time in the sense of there was this whole wave of whistleblowers in the US about, drone warfare. That happened way later, like 2014, 15, and onwards until today. We see examples like Daniel Hale. And back home, she revealed information about, she was working as a military secretary, right, in an office, and she was privy to a lot of information that was, above which she probably was supposed to, but she saw a lot of information that had to do with protocols on collateral damage, which is very much related to, international law, warfare law, and sort of how the debates, how it was being debated internally in terms of, okay, with targeted killings, how many innocents can, die in the territories so that a really bad person can be sort of eliminated from the equation. And she went out, after she finished her military service, she went out with this information to a reporter in Haaretz, Uri Blau, that then sold her out. And well, he was under pressure from the Shabak, but at the end of the day, she was found out. So it started with anonymous whistleblowing, right? Action of, handing in sort of this mega leak with information. And it ended with her at the beginning being in Matal Minali, which is sort of like house arrest for a year, and the whole story being under, heavy censorship. And then when it got out, the Israeli Society response was, she was demonized as a traitor. Her family got death threats. She wasn't accepted as a hero. So when we think of that versus, an Ellsberg case or other cases, there were those fringe groups, anti-war groups that supported her, but she didn't really have a network, which is something that really can explain the difference between, whistleblowing cases, whether they have people around them that help them get that information out, and then also gain control over the narrative about, what they disclosed.
So with your knowledge of all this, I sort of have two questions. They're
Yeah.
both somewhat controversial, so feel free to dodge accordingly.
Yeah.
How much do you trust, this, IDF spokesperson standardized line? I mean, when they say something, as somebody who studies all of the cases in which people are exposing the fraud, and the IDF spokesperson gets up and says, here is why we had to attack X hospital in Lebanon, or, blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
I mean, are you giving that, is that 50-50 of like, you have no idea if they're lying? Do you think they usually tell the truth, but every once in a while they're lying? Are they never telling the truth? I mean, how do you sort of view that?
I would kind of, strategically dodge the percentage question and relate that to a more, should we trust, lies in politics, right? Because lies in politics is something that is as old as time. And for those systems, it's not even lying. It's just maybe like strategic information sharing that has to do with both, as we said, national security and, notifying the public in a strategic way so that the public feels that they're in the know, right? But maybe it might be like it might be like non-information, right?
But I guess a more pointed question. So I
Yeah.
did a podcast, I think a year ago now,
Yeah.
About epistemology and the Israel-Gaza war, in terms of it is so hard to know what's true, right? Like
Yes.
if I don't pick teams and I just want as a rational observer, I obviously am biased here. I mean, I am, quote unquote, more on Israel's side if it is a binary, but I don't think it's a binary. But without going into that tangent, if I just want to know as an objective observer, like what are the facts, what should I believe, who should I trust? And you look in the landscape, it's very hard to know like how much credence to give. This is something that I've had Alon Burstein on the
Yeah.
podcast many times. He studies terrorism, so I always have this question for him of, who do you trust? Do you trust, the Hamas spokesperson and Hezbollah spokesperson? He has an interesting nuanced view of actually there are times where you trust these groups because they have an incentive to tell the truth, other times not. But if I'm coming out and trying to like gauge epistemological weight of trying to figure out, even in cases, last week the IDF bombed a hospital in Gaza. One side is saying this was a base of, terrorist base. The other side is saying this was a functional hospital that maybe just happened to have a terrorist walk into it once. I mean, you have just completely different stories. So personally, I mean, I give the Hamas spokesperson very little epistemological weight, and because there's very little freedom of press in Gaza, I tend not to trust those narratives. My trust of the IDF tends to be quite high, obviously not perfect, but I'm curious. I mean, do you think that's unreasonable? Or do you think like, no, also, probably for every whistleblower case we know about, there's 900, times that amount of people that just are shutting up right now and seeing things that they're like, oh my God, this goes against whatever. So I'm just curious, I mean, has that changed your just skepticism of, you don't even need to talk about pointed IDF. I mean, when the American government says something, or, from everything from, I don't know, the CDC on COVID to, whatever else is going on. I mean, how much as somebody whose entire job is to study the cases where people are publicly exposing, I mean, where do you even try to get your epistemological certainty of like how what's true politically? I know it's a broad question.
No, I mean, this is great. I study whistleblowers because they give me hope. I think it's not like I study it and then I become like more cynical about like what's true and everything. I think that at the end of the day, maybe we can't trust the institutions. Maybe we can't trust what the spokesperson is saying because they have their own innate strategic interests, it's not even about notifying the public, right? They have different aims. The IDF's main aim isn't to notify the public about his actions, right? It's to win the war in that sense, like just in terms of like black and white, what's their main goal, right? But for me, maybe I can't trust the institutions, but I can trust the people within them to do the right thing. And that's something that you see time and time again particularly in contexts that with like maybe more liberal democracies in the world where people don't have like very good whistleblowing protections or frameworks, you still see people coming out. That doesn't, in a sense, that doesn't make sense rationally, right? Because it ends badly for them. Like, why would they do it? Even in the US with, you know, one of the best whistleblowing protections that there is, protections even for people, you know, within the national security realm, you know, for military whistleblowers, for example. You still see many suffer the consequences of their actions, of, you know, what they thought was the right thing. And that gives me hope, even if, you know, the end goal isn't, you know, even if it doesn't end well for them, at the end of the day, the public is discussing it. And I do trust in, you know, soldiers seeing something and saying something, you know, so that's something that, and it could be done anonymously because they're afraid of the repercussions. That's okay. There's all these platforms you discussed. There's Shobrim Shtika, there's international. I know it might piss people off, right?
Yeah,
Maybe.
well, let me give you my gripe, you know, I know that we did not plan to discuss this, but
No, it's good.
here's my gripe with breaking the silence, and you can tell me if this is warranted or not, and, you know, you don't need to give your own opinion. You know, so I think, you know, just for listeners' background, Breaking the Silence is a NGO in Israel, you know, seen as, you know, relatively far left, and it's ex-soldiers or current soldiers that see, you know, human rights atrocities being done in the IDF, and then, you know, break the silence, they go public with it. I have no doubt that they're telling the truth, and it's probably an important service that they're telling people. From a global political, you know, perspective. Groups like Breaking the Silence, I mean, again, they're not loved in Israel, but they are protected, right? I mean, you know, it's not like, you know, Breaking the Silence offices are being raided every second by like anti-Breaking the Silence. Whereas when you have more illiberal countries, and the fact that there would be an NGO like Breaking the Silence, I mean, you know, in a place like, let's say, Iran right now, I mean, it's just laughable. So it almost, because Western countries allow for more freedom, it almost seems like there's more ways to criticize it internationally, because even internally, and that's and people aren't very good at, I think, balancing this. So I think, you know, your third party Western observer who's reading the news and maybe tries to read, you know, both right and left, and the New York Times and Al Jazeera all the way through, you know, Aretz Sheva, you know, a right-wing Israeli media, might say, hey, it seems like Israel is actually doing a lot of bad things because there's a lot of reports of, you know, whistleblowing and breaking the silence. Whereas when you talk about anything from, you know, Hezbollah or Hamas to even the Iranian government, or even, you know, these other countries, you know, the genocide in Sudan that's happening right now that nobody knows about, because there's such little freedom there, nobody ever talks about it. So it seems to like disproportionately weigh the negativity of Israel. And this is totally like an outside Israel perspective.
Yeah.
And so to me, I almost feel like if I was Israeli, I would appreciate groups like Breaking the Silence in a way that, being American, I'm like, they're so annoying because, you know.
Well,
Yeah,
let me tell you,
yeah, go ahead.
they're not appreciated back home. Like, they're a fringe group,
Sure.
and for the reasons that you mentioned, that, you know, it's always viewed as, you know, washing the dirty laundry out, you know,
Yeah.
out in the open, and why discuss, you know, why now, or just, you know, even the topic of criticism during wartime of these institutions might be frowned upon, as, you know, it might be demoralizing for soldiers. But I don't think that, you know, war crimes or just in general violations should be, you know, swept under the rug for an international sort of viewer. I think that the other way around. When I discuss this, and I don't represent anyone besides myself in this opinion, right?
Yeah.
Like I represent it from, like, you know, a scholarly standpoint, from a human standpoint. I think that when I showcase a more nuanced approach of, yes, you know, it's war, it's messy. There's, you know, there's horrific actions happening on both sides, and I would never wish anyone to be in this situation, right? But I come from a perspective of an embodied experience of war. I had, you know, missiles over my head in the past year. I arrived here a few months ago, so I know what it was like to be in Israel in October 7th and the months afterwards. So when I come from this nuanced perspective, and I say, and I tell my students, or, you know, anyone, I say, yes, like, these horrific actions are happening both in Israel and in Gaza. And, you know, it's a terrible terrible tragedy, and this is why we have to, do something about it, right? There are people working within these systems to make them better. This isn't who we are as the IDF, right? See, there's these groups who try to fight back at it. I think that's something that actually strengthens, trust. I don't know if you meant sort of like this international standpoint of Israel. I think it strengthens, the understanding that Israel as a democracy is upholding, certain rules, regarding warfare.
I would hope so. I guess
Yeah.
my gripe, it's a very unfair gripe.
Yeah.
And so I'll phrase it with that. I mean, it's even sort of the way that I view some of the more left-wing journalists at Haaretz, where the work they're doing is super important, and at the same time, it lends credence to a type of strong anti-Israelism that's saying, see, even Israelis are pointing this out, whereas on their side, because there's no freedom to start with, you're almost never going to have, a journalist in Gaza writing about Hamas's corruption. I mean, it's just, there are people outside that are, but, you're not, a whistleblower within Hamas is almost like a laughable thing, and it's not because Hamas is not doing anything wrong. It's the opposite. It's like they're almost so, it's almost Israel's attempt to self-police itself, which makes sense and all democracies need, ends up being used against it in this wider media war. Whereas a lot of times, the proxies that are surrounding it are so black and white, where they push out all criticism. Again, it's an unfair gripe, because I wouldn't want it the other way around. Like, I wouldn't want Israel to not have, these journalists there, but it's just something that bugs me. So we can move on, just one or two more questions, and then if there's anything else you think we didn't get to, this is going to be another unfair question, but it's one that I do ask all Israeli political scientists when I talk to them, especially those that have something to do with the military. You mentioned this idea that this claim that Israel is the most moral army in the world. Is this a talking point? Is there any truth to this? Is this completely wrong? I mean, what does that even mean? It's one that's very popular in the Jewish community. I mean, I probably, every time the IDF comes up in the American Jewish community, someone inevitably says, but yes, the IDF is the most moral army in the world. And
this is a kind of slogan that originates, I think, from Hezbollah, like from the Israeli Hezbollah regarding the IDF, and also the claim that, other places don't have to uphold the same standards. So that it can be seen as like a form of whataboutism in a second, but what about, what if we'd send all these queers to Gaza? How would they like it? Like those types of debates. I feel at the end of the day, it's missing maybe a central point that's important to me, as an Israeli, right? Like maybe to others, they have, other points, which is we want to do good, be good for ourselves, not only for, so people think about us in a certain way, like, right? Like might maybe even relate more to the religious aspects that I was asking myself before, that we were discussing before the podcast about, like, the relation between, whistleblowing and tikkun olam. We can get to that if you'd want.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think that, the IDF needs to uphold certain standards for the IDF and for the Israeli people, right? And not only so that it's, viewed a certain way externally, or to justify its existence.
But I think that is a powerful tension that I think I personally have wrestled with. I'm just talking, just solely for myself and my own political tornness, which is why I said, if I was Israeli, I'd probably be much more left-wing than if I, was an American Jew, from the outside looking in, which is that you want to be good for its own sake. And, totally, I think, both what Israel represents and what Jewish tradition represents, Israel should internally, and Jews and Israelis should hold Israel up to a higher standard. Yet on the world stage, Israel is always given a double standard. So there's that tension there where I'm happy we're, forcing Israel to these higher standards, or, urging Israel to these higher standards, yet it ends up oftentimes backfiring, especially, the way that Israel's talked about, in, liberal circles, in Europe and America, where, sometimes it's frustrating that Haaretz publishes some long thing about, I don't know, settlers going through and destroying Palestinian villages, which is abhorrent. I mean, I think anybody with moral conscience should say, what the settlers have been doing for the last couple of years, is crazy. On the other hand, if that is taking up, if 20% of the articles that are making it through to, an American audience about Israel are settlers burning down, Palestinian villages, that's going to be a de facto skewed view of Israel. And they're going to think, these settlers represent 30% of the population when it's probably, 0.3% of the population.
Yeah, I think that really a big part of my role, within, because of course, media debates are very different than academic debates. And, this space of even the university that, I wasn't here last year, but I've heard that things got pretty tense also at UCI. The ways in which these debates play out in the classroom are completely different, where, I add that context that is missing maybe from those, news articles,
Yeah.
and then it's pretty frustrating. But I do think that, a balanced sort of contextualizing debate needs to happen, in this context. You can't sweep issues that are difficult under the rug for your own integrity, right? As a person, as a scholar, like I'm not gonna not discuss,
Yeah, of course.
But I do understand sort of the frustration and how that plays out in a, culture war or sort of information war, how it's discussed. I just think that maybe sort of in the more sort of as a democracy, sort of, it's not nice to have these sort of standards, right? Yeah. I really see it as an intrinsic part of Israel's right to exist. So I feel that, having morality or sort of ethical standards within systems is something that is important for the existence of these systems, right? And then that can also be used within Hasbara or whatever debates on sort of why it's okay to do X, Y, Z, right? I'm not sure if that's
I think
but at the end of the day, at the end of the day, this is also something that I think internally and within Israel is not very understood very well. Because even in the sort of discussion on hostages, people in Israel are saying, what's the problem? We just, we start torturing these are like, sort of debate, nobody's torturing anyone, but this sort of the debates were, we'll torture the Palestinians that we do have, the Nukhba and terrorists that we caught until, they report back to Hamas, and then Hamas will release the hostages. We just apply more and more pressure in ways that are illegal, right? And then that will help, get us out of the terrible tragedy that we're in. But I don't think that violence is the answer ever, right? That's just me. Yeah. And I don't think that, and they don't understand really that sort of upholding international law isn't just a nice to have thing. It's something that we get as a part of our responsibilities as a, democracy that is a part of the UN or that is a part of these systems, right? The shmum doesn't really apply today. It just isn't relevant anymore. Do you know what shmum means, by the way?
I was going to totally shake my head and hope that the listeners had any idea.
No, good. This is good.
It was going to be the first thing that I was going to Google right now.
No, sorry about that. Shmum. Is UN in Hebrew. Okay. And then shmum is, it's like saying UN shmuin. UN shmuin. Okay, got it. Right? So so that idea of, these systems, international systems don't apply to us, right? I don't believe in that. I think that, they have a specific, I would say, they have a specific role, and that we need to respect that, because that also lends ourselves, the legitimacy and the credibility that we do need, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm trying to think if I want to push back or I want to move on. Just one more comment. I hope this doesn't derail us. Just I just the half of me, I have the angel and the devil here. I don't know which one is which. Say it, don't say it. Is that true even though, say, like the UN Human Rights, Council just has countries that, it just almost seems like a satire to some extent when you have, Iran being elected to the human rights, these countries that are so backwards.
I remember
from an Israel perspective, it seems like, okay, I would get if it's, not that I even think these countries are doing so great either, but if it's like, England, France, Canada, and America, like, okay, maybe, we'd listen to them, but like, why listen to the morals of, I don't know, Yemen, Iran, Saudi, these countries?
I think I listened to your discussion with Alon, and you asked him like a very similar question.
I know we had it's funny because every single podcast, Alon and I, just for listeners, because now it's funny because this is the office that Alone had for the last 3 years. So in this very
I'm
office,
embodying his spirit
you're
right now.
embodying the spirit. In this very office, Alone and I probably sat for 10 hours over the last 3 years are discussing this exact question. But
Yeah.
and every time it came up, I was like, don't fall into this. And so I figured, just the spirit of the office is beckoning the question.
No, it's good. I mean, no one's saying that the UN's perfect. No one's saying that, it's completely unbiased, but I'm saying all this is irrelevant. Like I'm also coming from like it's not irrelevant on, diplomatic sort of relations level, or like even an IR level, right? But I am saying in terms of the internal politics of Israel and why Israelis should care about, not violating international law. I think at the end of the day, they should be looking internally. Like, what does that, because I'm not like a researcher on like, moral, I think it's called, I forget the name, but sort of like psi'a musarit, which is kind of like a moral injury. That's the term I was looking for. So I'm not a specialist on that, but definitely there was a really interesting conceptualization on how like whatever is happening right now for people on the left in Israel very much feels like a moral injury as it dredges on, because they might feel less and less inclined with whatever's going on. On the one hand, you might very much like it's not as polarized as the discussions here on Israel's right to exist, nothing like that, right? Because you do believe in the existence of Israel, the necessity for it. You are a Zionist in the end of the day, but you don't really necessarily agree with everything that's going on, right? So I don't think that, so at the end of the day, the reason for resisting actions that that are immoral, illegal, right? Even on international standards, at the end of the day have nothing to do with how Israel's discussed. It's just about, who we are and who we want to be.
No, you're totally right. I mean, I think just to kind of summarize, no, I essentially agree. No, I essentially agree with you. I'm just, all the argument was my devil's advocate that every time I sort of have, instead of the angel and the devil, it's like the left-wing version of me and the right-wing version of me that, I duke it out constantly.
I understand the tension. Definitely understand it.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, which is ultimately I agree with, which is if there's one, let's just give it a weight. If you have 2 human rights violations within your community, it doesn't help that the other community has 10. You should still take care of your 2, which I essentially
and
agree
it
with.
might also have something to do with, at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be in tension with each other. Like war is messy, yes. The debates right now are messy and completely biased, yes. But our way to peace or to getting out of this mess isn't through violence. And if we allow it to continue on, then it'll just make things worse for Israel. Like not even talking about like for Gazans or for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It will just make things worse for us internally as people. So that's why.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, 2 more quick questions, and I'll open it up to anything you think we missed. Were you scared at all to come to an American campus? I mean, it was funny because, last November, December, January, I probably got more calls and texts from Israeli friends and family of mine asking if I was okay than times. I mean, obviously in October, I texted everyone, are you okay? Are you okay? But then in November, it was like they thought that, the whole world was on fire here. So I'm just curious, as you were probably, getting a lot of that Israeli media of what was happening on American college campuses. I mean, what were those conversations like? And did you have any, worries of, coming to, I don't know, the big scary American campus?
Definitely a lot of worries. I think that Israeli media on last year on what was going on in campuses was very, alarming. But then also I felt like a detective almost trying to figure out the middle ground between what I was hearing about from people that are in these campuses or campuses where worldwide, like professors in Berlin to UCLA to other places that were saying, yeah, actually, yes, these very disturbing things are happening, but it's nothing compared to what you guys are going through, I can assure you, and you're doing the right thing to go on with it. So I'm very happy that I listened to them at the end of the day, because these worries were on my mind. And And even just, discussing these topics, I think I was pushed today, with questions more than I was even, in my courses, which is funny. I thought that it would be way, more challenging. It was challenging in different ways because I feel like my role was also to sort of mediate Israeli society in a way that I might take for granted as an Israeli, right? But it really made me more aware of like my hybrid identity, both as like, an Israeli, but also as an American that has lived most of their lives in Israel and sort of understanding sort of what students would know about more or less and trying to sort of bridge that gap. So that's something that I'm glad that it's part of the reason that I'm here, right? This is what I wanted to do, but definitely before taking that plunge or taking that step, I was worried. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're super happy that you're here. I'm super happy that you're here because I,
Yeah.
look forward to many more of these conversations. The last question, again, another unfair question, but, I can't let you off the hook without asking. I mean, what do you think is going to happen over the next couple months? We're obviously talking now. I'll probably put out this podcast in a couple of days, so it'll be before, let's say Trump takes over.
Yeah.
What do you think will happen in terms of, the new American administration vis-a-vis Israel? Obviously, we still don't really know what's going to emerge out of Syria and the new regime there. I mean, where do you think will be, not what you want to happen, but just descriptively, if you had to guess, and I won't hold this against you in June or July if we do another podcast then. But I mean, what do you think might, or what are the different, things that might happen out of this, inflection point moment right now?
It's definitely I would say like a reshuffling of in many, even as just, as a whistleblowing scholar, I see like this morning, Meta or like Zuckerberg made a statement that he's not going to be engaging in fact checking anymore, and like the overhaul of fact checking and, in Facebook, and that's like in the US, right? So these types, and then people are immediately questioning, oh, is it like related to sort of Trump? And of course it is. And so you see that in all sort of aspects. So I see that also related to Israel, but with Israel, I think it's very uncertain how it's actually going to be affecting. Some people think, I'm not represented, doesn't necessarily represent what I'm thinking, but some people think that that Bibi is sort of strategically dredging on with sort of the talks so that Trump could have a win, or that it's way more, that the talks about a hostage deal, that sort of all the developments that could lead to a different reality for Israelis and Palestinians right now is kind of dredging on because of that is before the inauguration. So we might see a change there. Is it because of Trump in the sense of Trump ushering a better era for Israel? I'm not so sure about that. I wouldn't argue that. Right.
I'm sure, post January 20th, I'll be doing many podcasts to discuss the reality. Anything else that we didn't discuss that you just think is good to get out there?
I think we might have to do another one because there's so many.
Oh, we'll for sure do another. Yeah, no.
I mean, the relationship between whistleblowing and religion, particularly Judaism. I was thinking this is, I've written about whistleblowers in Israel and the US, but not that much about sort of like religion and culture and how that plays in.
Well, it's worth going at it. If you got 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So, I didn't prepare any of this, but just on one foot, I think there's also a tension in Jewish tradition because there are a lot of statements in Jewish tradition, whoever doesn't protest the actions of their family or of their community and then of their country and then of the world, it's as if they did it, right? So you have this statement in the Talmud that basically says, if you see something and don't say something, actually you bear the brunt of that that wrongdoing, which seems to be very, I'll say pro whistleblower statement of, of course you have to uphold, morals if you see them. On the other hand, and we were talking about this on the way up here, because much of the Jewish condition in the last 2,000 years especially was being one of, relatively powerlessness and having no, governmental autonomy, no military autonomy, Jewish communities tended to be quite sheltered from either, the Christian or Islamic authorities, just depending on where they were in the world. And so Jewish tradition also built in this concept of what was called a moser, which a moser, as a Jewish legal principle is if, I don't know, say in the 1700s in Venice, it was discovered that the Jewish community is, that some guy is, cheating on their, taxes or whatever, and you decide to go tell the authorities, that actually being called a moser was one of the worst things you can be called. It was worse than a heretic as somebody, who informed the authorities because Jewish life was so precarious and so just, that any little thing, that one Jew did, immediately the whole community could be blamed for it. So there was this very delicate balance of like, okay, if you see something and don't say something, that's bad, and you basically bear the onus of whatever that wrongdoing is. On the other hand, if you say something, you can possibly jeopardize the condition of the entire Jewish community. That's obviously a very different condition than Israel, where, it's all sort of internal. But that's what I would say. I don't know if that jives with, what
Yeah, definitely. It really relates to our whole conversation that we had before about, I would argue about, solidarity and social solidarity, and, taking the dirty laundry out versus not doing that, right? Because of, the relationship within the community, right? So it could be a Jewish community, it could be Israel, and Israel is just, one big Jewish community in a sense. So you could see, I could see the parallels there. But on the other hand, I do think that whistleblowers are not informers in that sense.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think Jews also, obviously it's not super new, it's 70 plus years old, but like Jews are still getting used to having power. I think that's sort of like a weird statement, but much of our tradition over the last 2,000 years developed within no power. And, now with Zionism and the state of Israel, there's this big question of like, okay, well, you have power. How do you use it? That comes with a whole set of different moral considerations than if you have no power. One of the things that, David Hartman, who was a rabbi in the 20th century in Israel, set up the Hartman Institute. They actually did a lot of work on the IDF Code of Ethics. So I think they're very much in this conversation. One of the things that he used to always say in speeches, much to the shock of audiences, he's been dead for a while now, but his son, Daniel Hartman, also says this in speeches that the most moral people in the world were Holocaust survivors because they had no, and he kind of waits for everybody to have that shock, and he's like, because they had no power. If you have no power, you have no moral onus on you if you for whatever reason, versus on the flip side, to quote Spider-Man, if you have a lot of power, it's not necessarily bad, right? I think, there are some that mistake power with ipso facto evil, but obviously the more power you have, the more of a chance you have to do evil. And I think, Israel has a lot
Is that how the Spider-Man
I think
goes?
with great power,
Great responsibility.
Yeah, it was cut a little bit shorter. We got the whole, Megillah there and monologue, but yeah, I just think Israel in a lot of ways is still wrestling with this of like, what do you do, because Jews still kind of think of ourselves as powerless. We're still, we haven't like updated for the reality of like, no, actually Israel is a first world superpower allied with America, the superpower, and Jews kind of still think of themselves as like, well, any wrong thing now and the Cossacks come in and kill all of us, and like that's not really the case anymore. But I think it's hard to get that out of our mentality.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that. Like that Gewalt syndrome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this was great. Thank you so much. And we'll definitely do this again.
Thank you.